Good evening, wherever it is that you're listening from, and welcome to this audio-only podcast retelling of the story of Hisashi Ouchi. So, put on your headphones, dim your lights, and put your feet up, and let me narrate the rest of the story for you. In 1999, Japanese nuclear worker Hisashi Ouchi and his colleagues made a mistake while working at the nuclear fuel conversion company in Tokaimura. That mistake would lead to Ouchi being bedridden and unable to move for 83 days, where he would endure a sickening series of increasingly more painful injuries and illnesses, which would cause his body to slowly decompose while he was still alive, leaving him in constant searing pain and suffering. This is his story. On the morning of September 30th, 3 Japanese nuclear technicians named Hisashi Ouchi, Yutaka Yokokawa, and Masato Shinohara arrived at the JCO nuclear fuel conversion facility in Tokaimura for their day's work. The JCO plant wasn't a power generating facility, but rather one which created the fuel rods for other power plants. They did this by a process of converting uranium hexafluoride into uranium dioxide. This would be the Tokaimura plant's first batch of fuel in 3 years. As such, there was no dedicated trained staff for this role, and whichever technicians happened to be available on the day would be the people that fulfilled the role. The approved procedure to make this fuel is that uranium powder is dissolved in nitric acid in the dissolution tank. This pure mixture is then pumped into a much taller storage tank called a buffer tank. It would then slowly be transferred into a wide tank called a precipitation tank, where it would be mechanically mixed. The design of the buffer tank prevented the fuel from going critical due to its tall cylindrical shape, and the fact that it was not properly mixed yet. The purpose of this design was to control the flow of mixture into the large precipitation tank to prevent the mixture from going critical as it was stirred mechanically. There was also a water cooling jacket around the precipitation tank which removed excess heat as it was generated by the stirring of the mixture, which also prevented the mixture from going critical when the exothermic reaction begins. The approved concentration of the uranium powder for this process was 5%. 3 years prior to this date, the JCO company had modified the official procedure so that the uranyl nitrate solution could be made in stainless steel buckets by hand, rather than placing the ingredients into the dissolution tank. This was illegal and against government regulations, but it never led to any accidents due to the low concentration of uranium which was used. When the 3 workers arrived that day, the facility was already 2 days behind schedule for delivery of the nuclear fuel rods, which were to be created. The company put pressure on the staff to complete the procedure as quick as possible, and so the technicians modified the procedure even further. They were now mixing the uranyl nitrate solution in steel buckets and pouring it directly into the large precipitation tank. They were also using a uranium concentration much higher than anyone had previously, at about 18.8%, more than double the recommended concentration. And they were doing this in order to create the fuel as fast as possible. At around 10:35 a.m., after the precipitation tank reached 40 litres of highly concentrated uranyl nitrate solution, the radiation alarm sounded, and the 3 workers reported seeing a blue flash as Cherenkov radiation signaled that the mixture was generating enough heat to start a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction and sent out blasts of gamma and neutron radiation. Ouchi absorbed the highest dose of radiation as he actually had his body pressed against the tank to assist in pouring, while Shinohara was standing on a platform pouring the liquid into the tank and received the second largest dose. Yokokawa was sitting at a desk a few feet away and received the smallest dose of radiation. The internationally acknowledged radiation safety limit per person per year is 20 millisieverts. The dose considered fatal is 5,000 millisieverts. Ouchi received 17,000 millisieverts of radiation, which is 3 times the amount considered lethal. Shinohara, 1,000, and Yokokawa received 3,000. Almost immediately, Ouchi and Shinohara felt waves of pain and nausea, and both struggled to breathe. And the three men fled to a nearby changing room where Ouchi vomited and passed out. The three men were sent to the hospital with the two most irradiated, Ouchi and Shinohara, quickly transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital, as it had more modern facilities, more qualified staff, and cutting-edge procedures and treatments. Later that evening, when nurses initially tended to Ouchi, they couldn't believe that he had received a fatal dose of radiation. He looked slightly reddish, as though he was a little sunburned, and had no obvious symptoms with the exception of slightly red and swollen hand. He was also alert, talkative, and friendly. One of the nurses commented that she thought he may be able to go home that day. It wasn't until the test results came back that the real problem was revealed. The human body is maintained by a function of many different cell types being shed or excreted and then replaced by a new cell. Our chromosomes contain the instructions for the replication of all cell types. These instructions are incredibly important as cell replication is impossible without them. When the doctors examined Ouchi's test results, they understood the size and magnitude of the problem. Normal chromosomes can be arranged and identified quite easily, but Ouchi's chromosomes had been decimated by radiation, leaving them unorganized, malformed, mutated, and in some cases fused together. The radiation had literally ripped apart his DNA and scrambled it, to the point where the cell instructions were no longer usable inside his body. And while his body could no longer create new cells, it did still have a supply of cells which had been created before the radiation had destroyed his chromosomes, and this explained why his outward appearance looked healthy. When that supply of cells ran out, Ouchi's real nightmare would begin. Ouchi's white blood cell count plummeted to 10% of what is considered normal and healthy, making him incredibly vulnerable to viral and bacterial infections. To prevent this, he was moved into a sterile room. Dr. Maekawa, that was the doctor in charge of the team who would attempt to save Ouchi's life. Their first priority was Ouchi's inability to generate new cells. Without this, saving Ouchi's life would be impossible. After some discussion, Dr. Maekawa suggested that the best course of action would be to try an experimental new procedure called peripheral blood stem cell transplantation. This is a procedure in which healthy stem cells are harvested from a donor and then administered intravenously into the patient. The cells then migrate to the bone marrow and override the damaged ones, enabling the bone marrow to begin creating healthy cells again. The only issue was that the donor would need to be a good match for Ouchi, and so they began testing potential donors. Luckily for Ouchi, his sister was a perfect match, and so healthy cells were harvested from her and administered to him through an IV. It would be 10 days before the team would know if the treatment was working. Knowing that the chances of success were slim, and that the family were likely to cling to faint hopes, Dr. Maekawa allowed the family to see Ouchi on a daily basis in the hope that seeing his rapid decline would help them to accept the reality of what was happening. He also told Ouchi's wife that it was very likely that her husband would get much, much worse. Ouchi seemed to be either in a state of denial or obliviousness about his condition, as he asked the nurse, "When you're exposed to radiation like this, is there a risk of contracting leukemia or something?" That kind of demonstrated that he didn't understand that he was very unlikely to live long enough for leukemia to kill him, even if he did get it. Over the next few days, Ouchi would deteriorate, as his skin cell stores were quickly exhausted. His skin lost its elasticity and solidity and began to fall off in chunks, and staff noticed that whenever they removed medical tape, it would also peel thick pieces of skin away from Ouchi's body. The doctor then stopped any further use of medical tape against his skin. At times, Ouchi would struggle to breathe as fluid started to build up in his lungs. The team considered putting him on a respirator, but after seeing him tell his wife how much he loved her, they decided to wait and allow them both to have more time to speak with each other. It would, however, be very short-lived, as the next day, Ouchi could no longer breathe and he was intubated and given respiratory assistance. While nobody knew for sure what would happen to Ouchi, the staff understood that he was unlikely to survive and he was very likely to deteriorate. The family, however, visited every day and as is a Japanese custom, they would fold a paper crane. They wanted to put a crane by his bedside, but the risk of infection was too great. In Japanese legend, it's said that the person who folds 1,000 paper cranes will either be granted a wish or long life and recovery by the gods. So, every day, the family folded paper cranes in the hope of making 1,000 to save their father and husband. 10 days after Ouchi was given his sister's stem cells, the test results came back, and Dr. Miyakawa called a meeting to discuss the results. Everyone was hoping to see his sister's chromosomes living inside his blood cells, and as they peered into the microscope at his blood cells, they saw 2 red dots, which signified that the sister cells were alive and healthy. Ouchi was the first person in the entire world to receive this treatment, and it had worked. Over the next few days, his white cell count would continue to increase to normal levels, and the risk of infection dropped significantly. Just 7 days later, Ouchi's skin began to deteriorate again, and endoscopy of Ouchi's intestines confirmed Dr. Miyakawa's worst fear. Ouchi's mucous membranes had turned white and drooped down, signaling that they had died. The mucous membranes are responsible for absorbing nutrients and fluid from the food we eat and the things that we drink. This meant that Ouchi would not be able to retain water and nutrients. By this point, Ouchi had become hostile towards the staff and said that he just wanted to go home. In an attempt to get answers, the team examined Ouchi's blood again. This time, instead of seeing the healthy cells, they saw mutated cells that had been corrupted by radiation. Ouchi's body had absorbed so much neutron radiation when he was exposed that it had damaged the transplanted cells from his sister. The medical team and Ouchi's family were devastated. Shortly after, Ouchi began to experience gastrointestinal pain and discomfort as his body excreted 3 liters of diarrhea every day. After 3 weeks, his intestines began to bleed from the wound where the mucous membrane had died and peeled away. It quickly became necessary to give Ouchi blood transfusions. On some days, he was given 10 transfusions in a single day. The team tried a variety of drugs to help improve some of the symptoms, but none of them would stay in his system long enough because of the diarrhea and bleeding. Ouchi was then transferred to a specialist bed for the critically ill, a bed which tilts to improve systemic circulation and to prevent bed sores from building up on his skin. Once Ouchi's skin had fallen off, he started to lose fluids rapidly. He lost approximately 10 liters of body fluids every single day, which had to be replaced with IV fluids. In an attempt to try and retain what little layers of skin Ouchi had left, the medical staff wrapped almost his entire body in medical gauze, hoping that this would keep the skin in place and help him retain fluids. But it didn't help. His weeping and bleeding skin would exudate profusely, and the bandages would become completely soaked in blood and fluids in just a few hours. Because his eyelids had mostly fallen off, Ouchi's eye would get dry and bleed. Due to the level of pain he was in, he was given large doses of narcotics to help him sleep and ease the pain. Dr. Miyakawa spoke with Ouchi's family to advise that he was very unlikely to improve and that he could get worse still. The family asked him to do all that he could, but the only thing that he had left to try was the massive skin grafts from lab-cultured skin. Dr. Miyakawa hoped that if the skin took, then it would help him keep his fluids and buy them time to find other ways to help him. Unfortunately, due to the sheer volume of fluids lost through the exposed areas of his body, the skin grafts wouldn't adhere and quickly fell off. With the exception of the short time that the cell transplantation had worked, everything else had failed, and there were no more options left. The hospital staff started to accept that there was nothing more that they could do to help Ouchi. It had been 2 months since Ouchi had first been admitted. He had undergone repeated blood transfusions, skin grafts. He had been given stem cell transplantations. He was breathing through the use of a mechanical respirator. His skin had literally rotted away and fallen off of his body. His eyes couldn't close even when he slept because he had no eyelids. He was bleeding from his intestines and he was in searing pain at all times. But he was alive. The massive blood loss and repeated transfusions was having a secondary effect. Ouchi's heart was pumping at over 120 beats per minute. The stress on his cardiac muscle was immense, and then it stopped. Due to the lack of a do not resuscitate order, the medical team were legally bound to do their best to bring him back to life again, and so they quickly performed cardiac massage. His heart started beating again, but then promptly stopped. The team administered cardiotonic drugs to assist him, and after stopping and starting 3 times, it returned to a steady yet very fast beat. The stopping and restarting of his heart had a negative effect on Ouchi's brain and kidneys. Function was beginning to decline. When Ouchi's family called to him, he no longer had any response, and he was entirely dependent on medical equipment for survival. While Ouchi's family had not yet given up, his body was telling a different story. Ouchi's immune cells had become abnormal and were attacking what healthy white blood cells he had left. In a short space of time, he had no white blood cells at all. Even a common cold would kill him in a matter of hours. On the 81st night after Ouchi was admitted, Dr. Maekawa gathered the family members in a visiting room and advised them that Hisashi Ouchi could not be saved, and that should his heart stop again, he should not be revived. His wife and son wept by his bedside. On day 83, Ouchi's wife and son visited him. The medical staff removed the gauze from his face so that they could look at him for one last time. And then, on the 83rd night of Hisashi Ouchi's brutal battle for his life, his heart stopped and he passed away. So, that's the story of Hisashi Ouchi. All of the stories that are going to feature in these audio-only podcasts are ones which I've already released, usually a long time ago, which affords me the benefit of hindsight and the ability to address questions that people might have left on those videos in the past, and to discuss them in more detail. So, firstly, a lot of people in the comments have been persuaded or influenced by other videos and articles on this topic that came before my video, which unfairly painted the medical staff as being evil and keeping Hisashi Ouchi alive against his will in order to experiment on him, which absolutely isn't true. The information from my video came from months of researching of Hisashi Ouchi's medical records, and a very good Japanese documentary that I found where they did actually interview some of the people who were involved, and some clips of that video are actually in the full video on my channel if you're interested in seeing them, and I linked it in the description as well. These medical staff weren't evil people. They were people whose job it was to save someone's life to the best of their ability. And they genuinely did believe that trying the stem cell transplantation would work. And when it didn't work, they told the family that it wouldn't work. So it's unfair to label them as evil, because they really weren't. And if you watch the interviews with them, some of them were quite severely mentally scarred by the incident much later as well. Secondly, when you see people talk about this particular story and case, they will often quote or reference a photograph of a man wrapped in bandages with his arms and legs elevated in the air, in a pretty horrific condition. If you Google Hisashi Ouchi, you will see the picture I'm referring to immediately. And they will say that this is a picture of Ouchi, and it's actually not. It took me a long time to find the source of this picture, but I actually knew instantly that it wasn't Ouchi, because if you look at his right leg, I think, it's elevated into the air. And the foot has been amputated from the leg, and Ouchi had no amputations, so I knew right away that that wasn't him. But it did take me quite a long time to find the source of that photograph, and it's actually from a medical textbook from a Chicago hospital in the 1970s, which talks about how to treat extreme burns victims, which is also why he's in the horrific condition that he's in. Another question or comment that I get on the video often is how Hisashi Ouchi's heart remains so strong despite receiving so much radiation. I don't expect the average person to know this, but if you work in any type of radiography or radiology role, then you'll know that actually heart tissue is really radio insensitive. It doesn't absorb radiation easily. It's actually very radio resistant, which is why the heart tissue in Ouchi's case was still pretty much in perfect condition, despite receiving one of the highest doses of radiation in history. I guess this brings me on to the second thing which people often comment on the main video, which is I titled the video as the most radioactive person in history. He isn't. There are people that have received higher doses of radiation, and in fact even the way I phrased the title, the most radioactive person in history, is incorrect, because radioactive would suggest that you emit radiation, not that you've received it. Even though Hisashi Ouchi did actually emit a little bit of radiation because his bones absorbed neutron radiation, and neutron radiation has been shown to be able to pierce inanimate objects and make them radioactive. It's not that common, and it does require enormous doses of neutron radiation, but I think both of those things really do apply in Ouchi's case. A lot of people also comment on how the family were cruel for keeping him alive, and I also find that to be very unfair. And I think the people who don't really understand the level of grief that they were going through are probably people that have never suffered from grief themselves, because it makes you very desperate, and it makes you cling to the faintest of hopes, no matter how unlikely that it is. So I don't blame the family for asking the doctors to do everything that they could to save him, even if it did cause him some short-term pain, because in their hearts they would have hoped that whatever decisions they made would have saved his life. They couldn't have known just how bad it was going to get, and nobody really did. You know, this kind of massive radiation absorption was something that was really not that well understood or well known outside of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did a lot of experiments with radiation on people. Some of them were insanely cruel. There's a pretty good documentary about it on YouTube somewhere. But they kept all that stuff secret. The rest of the world really didn't know as much about the effects of radiation as the Soviet Union did. You know, the government there really kept all of that classified. So when Ouchi was admitted with this radiation poisoning, this was like fairly unique. People hadn't experienced this before, and so a lot of the decisions they made were just sort of the best options that they could have taken given the options that were available at the time. So I really find it to be both disrespectful to the staff, to his family, and to him himself when people try to paint this inaccurate picture of a man held against his will to be experimented on by evil doctors, because that just isn't true. I mean, even in the story, I show it in the video, but obviously you can't hear it in the podcast version. There is a section of the original Japanese documentary which I included, which shows they wrote down all of Hisashi Ouchi's comments as they were treating him. And a lot of people always say that he begged to die. That's not true. He begged for it to stop. He didn't beg to die. When he said, make it stop, he wasn't saying kill me. He was saying, like, make the pain stop. He wasn't saying that he wanted to die. Multiple times throughout the whole of his treatments, you know, he wanted to stay with his family. He wanted to be connected to his family. I doubt that a man that connected to his family would just say, oh, just kill me. Again, people say these things without any real basis, and I'll give it this, it wasn't an easy topic to research. It took me a long time. It took me about 6 months to research this topic and come out with the information that I got. So if anyone didn't know the information that I knew, I can completely understand, because a lot of it I found in Japanese news archives and in a Japanese documentary and on Japanese websites. I found barely any of the information on Western sites, so it wasn't easy to find. But now that I've given you that information and shown it in the video too, it's not as if I made it up. I showed you the sources. I really wish people would leave that narrative of evil doctors experimenting on someone alone, because it's just not true. This is a horrific and tragic story of someone failed by corporate governance, for one, who medical science did their absolute best to save, and unfortunately The tools and understanding that they had at the time weren't good enough to save his life. But the suffering that he went through wasn't unnecessary. That was all to try and save him and send him back to his family. I hope that this version of the story was told well enough to hold your interest and attention. And I'll see you in a short time for another one of these podcasts. This podcast was mostly done to satisfy one person, so if you're listening, I really hope you enjoyed it.